So my name is Bobby, and I think we all know each other a little bit. Um, Jennifer is right down the road in the wonderful city of Pendleton. And then Tahina and I went to grad school here at Clemson, and she lives in California now in Palo Alto. And so anyway, I wanted to bring us all together. Tahina and I have started this series of talking with pastors across the country from all different denominations, trying to figure out how they're managing digital church and what their approaches are and what we're learning and what we're sharing, and just have a conversation about what digital church is now. I saw a really, and this is my introduction, but I saw a really great meme that came out yesterday for businesses that basically said, what started your digital transformation in your business? And the first one was CIO, second one was CTO, and the third one was COVID-19. And so I think you can actually apply that to the church, because what has charged or created a digital transformation in churches has forced churches right now to transform instantaneously like entrepreneurs in order to meet the demands of what we consider the church should keep on moving, and I think that's a paradigm that's hard to wrap our heads around in the world of digital transformation, what the church is like, what does this look like? We talked about digital stewardship. So anyway, Ellen Seacrest from CBF, who used to be one of our ministers, connected us to Jennifer. And so I was like, let's have a conversation. So anyway, I'm going to let Tahina introduce herself real quick, and then Jennifer, you do the same.
Okay.
And then I figured we'd just jump into conversation and just chat and have fun.
Okay.
So Tahina, take away.
Yeah, Tahina Verma Rash. I'm an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America as a minister of Word and Sacrament. I currently serve under what's known as a specialized call in my denomination to a church in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion denomination. So I'm serving as the minister of small groups, and a lot of the work that I've done has actually been through like doing digital small groups, online Bible studies, and so kind of like being a parish pastor for a while, but also like doing kind of like writing and speaking, and kind of wondering what does church look like that's not necessarily enclosed within the four walls of a church building.
And she's local. Tell about how you're connected to the Upstate.
So I went to Clemson for my undergraduate degree. Worked at Floor for a couple of years in Greenville, and then came back to Clemson to study Masters of Arts in Professional Communication, which is where Bobby and I met. So that's actually my connection to the Upstate. My mom and my brother are actually still in the Upstate. So I was actually, before all this went down for like sheltering in place in California and whatnot, like I was actually in the Upstate visiting my mom and brother before like everything went down.
So Jennifer, introduce yourself.
Okay. Well, I'm Jennifer Rygg. I'm pastor at First Baptist Church in Pendleton. I have been at First Baptist Pendleton for 11 years now, and I have been pastor there for 3 years. And so I was associate pastor. And then in 2015, our pastor went to another church, and we went through a transition process, and then they did end up calling me as pastor. And so I've been in that role for 3 years now. I'm actually from Georgia, but I moved here 11 years ago for the church. And then now I've gotten married since I've been here and have 2 kids. And so now South Carolina is home.
So tell us a little bit about First Baptist of Pendleton.
Okay. So we are I would say small to medium-sized church. We have 80-ish people on a Sunday morning in worship. Kind of varies depending on various things, like Clemson football schedule. Sometimes that affects our attendance. But we have one worship service that is a blended style, leans more traditional, but we try to incorporate some different elements. And then we have a very active Sunday school program that's very independent. One of the things I realized early on is they really didn't need or necessarily want me to do a lot of organizing for Sunday school. They just kind of do their own thing. But it's good. We've had a few issues, but for the most part, it's very healthy because they keep in touch with one another and take care of themselves and cover their classes and everything. So we have a pretty good Sunday school ministry. We have a lot of younger kids right now. We don't have a lot of elementary or teenagers, but we have a good number of young kids. So that, and partly because I have 2 in that group, and then we have another staff minister with 2 in that group. And so that adds a lot. And then also it encourages other families too. Yeah.
So tell me about a couple weeks ago, what was it like when, okay, so let me ask you this. When did you decide to change how you did everything? What happened and what caused you to make these decisions?
So on March 13th, which was a Friday, I don't really remember what specifically happened that day, but that was the day that, for whatever reason, I really realized, okay, this is here and this is affecting us. And I don't remember now if because there weren't cases in South Carolina yet. I think Georgia was starting to close things. South Carolina hadn't yet. And so I don't really remember where we were in the process, but that Friday, I spent most of the day watching updates and trying to figure out, do we need to make plans for Sunday? We did still have Sunday services that day, but we sent out messages to people encouraging them to stay home, to weigh the risk, stay home if they needed to. If you're volunteer, kind of similar things that we would do for weather-related closures. Don't come if it's not safe for you, but we're going to be here. And then we did a FaceTime live. So it was kind of we didn't really have time to plan it or, get it ready, but I kind of felt like, well, something's better than nothing. So we'll do something. That was my philosophy the first few days. And sometimes still now, something is better than nothing. So we'll offer something. And then so we did that Sunday morning, and then Sunday afternoon, the deacons had a meeting scheduled already. We did have significantly lower attendance that day, but we still had, I think 40 or 50 people there. And then at the deacons meeting, we talked about, okay, the deacons meeting was scheduled for 4:00, which was the same time the South Carolina governor was scheduled to make a speech. And so we watched it at the deacons meeting. He closed schools until the end of March at that time. And so we said, okay, this helps us make our decision too, because I already knew what we needed to do. It just helped to have that, official, okay, this is what they're doing. So it helps us make that decision. So at that time, we only closed for one Sunday. We said, let's reevaluate because that was March 15th. So we could close through the 27th and leave the 29th open. And so we were kind of taking a little bit at a time. And then, of course, very soon after that, we realized it was going to be much longer. And so just kind of taking it as we go. And at this point, we have now closed until further notice, or I don't say closed in my church communications. We say suspended in-person gatherings. And so we are now doing a YouTube video of worship. Once we had a little time to figure out a plan, not Friday before Sunday, our office manager, who is great and very innovative and creative, and has a camera, offered to video worship. And so we have been recording it on Thursday afternoons, and then which gives him time to edit a video together, and then it goes live on Sunday morning. And so it is a pre-recorded worship service, which mostly is because our office manager doesn't work on Sundays, and I'm not going to ask him to come in on Sundays so that we can do this. And it does let us do a better quality video. It doesn't have the interactive component of Facebook, but it's also you don't worry as much about somebody not being able to get in or all having to do it at the same time. And so people can watch it on their device at their convenience. And so seems to be letting more people participate. At this time, we're still able to go to church and record it there. And we've talked about the fact that might change. And we've talked about how we would manage that. And so we haven't had to do that yet.
So you had mentioned the interactive component of Facebook. What was that like when you had done that first worship service?
Well, we didn't use it a lot because I was still in the sanctuary and there were still 50 people there. And so, but I did talk to them. I did say, you know, we've got people joining this live. Oh, I see Kara's online. And, you know, so there was a little bit of that. And then I guess we didn't really interact that much, but there was the sense of doing it at the same time, which maybe adds, you know, to those watching at home, a sense that they're there and they're participating. But we didn't really do that much. And I also know at least one person, it stopped working partway through. And so I don't know, and I don't know why or what happened, but the new format has worked much better for her at least.
Okay.
One thing I want to ask, and I think this is a fascinating discussion when it comes to church leadership, is you said you sat with the deacons and had a discussion. I know at Boulevard Baptist, our deacons are more of shepherders as opposed to a decision-making body. We have more of a church council that meets and makes those decisions led by the pastors. Talk about the deacon structure in your church and your leadership structure and how your church makes those decisions, especially something as critical as this.
Well, ours is actually similar to Boulevard. What happened is the deacons already had a meeting scheduled for that day, and we were meeting anyway. So deacons are spiritual leaders, co-shepherds with the pastor is what the language says. And so sometimes I will go to them on, you know, I consider canceling worship or changing worship plans to certainly be a spiritual matter. And I told them when we met, I said, really, it's church council that makes scheduling decisions. And church council was scheduled to meet that Tuesday, so which it was very convenient because church council only meets once a quarter, but we had a meeting scheduled for like the 24th, I guess. So we ended up doing that meeting by Google Meet. We didn't meet in person, but we did it by Google Meet. So I told the deacons, you know, church council makes a scheduling decision, but I would like to be able to tell them the deacons recommend this. And also at that point, it was kind of time sensitive. We just needed to go ahead and make a decision. But ours is very similar. Church council sets the schedule and the church calendar, and then deacons are the ministers, co-shepherds with the pastor kind of thing. And so we did with the deacons, they have a flock that they each are responsible for. And so I did encourage them to be in touch with their flock, especially people who are older or might have special, you know, things that they would need during this time. And so we've tried to do that. And then I went through the flocks and tried to make sure people knew who was in their flock and make sure sometimes if somebody gets added during the year, the deacons don't get the message or it gets lost or something. And so I sent out an updated list saying, here is who I think is in your flock. If you are missing somebody, let me know, just to make sure everybody is accounted for. So that's really the big deacon role. And then church council made the decision about how long to close.
I think this is a fascinating discussion, mainly because many different churches across the nation have different decision-making patterns. You know, I spent a lot of time with the United Methodist Church of North Carolina, and they get word down from the bishops on, you know, are we going to close church? How do we manage all these different decisions? Whereas in our world, in the Baptist, specifically CBF world, each church is making their own decision based on what's going on in their life of their church. Tahina, talk about the decision-making pattern in the life of the church that you experienced. Is it kind of handed down, or how does that work, especially with something of this magnitude?
Well, and I think like it's really hard because I straddle two very different church worlds right now. So the church in which I am ordained, the denomination in which I'm ordained, we do have a bishop. And at that same time, our bishop holds some authority, but not necessarily all authority. So our bishop is a pastor to pastors, and our bishop is essentially like who we go to if we have questions or issues with our church governance, with our polity structure. And so ultimately, we actually are really more based in a congregational structure. And so it is up to the church councils of each congregation to make those decisions of whether to postpone all in-person gatherings or to like make the decisions for the congregation. But it's also looking, so like we also have like these really weird hierarchies of constitutional structure as well. So we have like our national church-wide constitution, we have our synodical, like geographic area constitution, and then we have our congregational constitution. And so it's kind of like, we call it the three expressions in the ELCA. And we try to kind of figure out how these three expressions work in tandem with one another, but how they also work independently of one another, which sounds really Trinitarian to me. And so with the AME Zion Church, so like this is actually where I need to explore more of what polity looks like in the AME Zion world. So when we found out that there were potential positive cases at Stanford in the first full week of March, and because the congregation where I serve is very closely tied to Stanford University, like that was, we made the decision right then and there as the board of trustees that we're suspending in-person gatherings, and that we will continue to live stream our worship services, which we had been doing, but we have to limit the number of people who have access to the building as a means of safety. So that decision was made by the board of trustees, like, boom, we're not, when we found out that we had the positive cases at Stanford, it was like we, in the interest of the safety of the congregation, and it was one of the hardest decisions ever, was that we can't have in-person worship right now.
It's a hard decision, I think. Jennifer, yesterday we were handed down, once again, another order from the governor, and Austin and I from Boulevard, the pastor at Boulevard, started texting immediately, reading the order, and he was like, does this shut us down? I'm like, I read it and I'm like, it mentions nothing about churches.
Right.
It does not say church. It does not say anything related to faith-based organizations. And what we were discerning from that is we were already, the congregation was not coming in for worship, but does that mean that we can no longer go in the church and produce a live stream for the congregation? So that was a separate decision. And so I reached out to our local representative here, who's actually coming off, Representative Gary Clary, and good friend of mine. And I said, Gary, tell me what you think about this. What does this look like in your opinion? He said, you got to remember, first of all, the governor did not mention any faith-based organizations on purpose because he can't touch the Fourth Amendment right now. And so what he can do is try to dissuade from health and safety. But so it looks like a lot of these decisions are coming down to churches to make their own decision. What is your thought with that, Jennifer, and how you're going to continue to monitor stuff, but how you make decisions on what to do and what not to do?
Well, that's really been a challenge. And there's been times when I've thought, oh, this is when it'd be nice to have a bishop to tell me what to do, and then we're done. Because I feel like it takes so much energy to not just figure out, because there was a point where we had only canceled in-person services through March 27th. And so I knew it had to go further than that. But I was trying to find out, okay, what is the official government recommendation? What is the official CDC recommendation, so that I can pass that on to the leadership of the church, to church council, and say, okay, this is what we need to do and why, not just, I just know, Yeah. And so I'm in a Facebook group for clergy dealing with COVID-19 responses, and it is interfaith. And so there's a lot of Jewish clergy in there. And it's all over the country.
I'm in there too.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think because it's like there are thousands of religious leaders who are in there,
Right.
who are trying to figure this out together and navigate this together, and also trying to shepherd one another and provide care for one another in the midst of this. Because as religious leaders, we're called to shepherd the flock. And I think that this is a very peculiar time to shepherd the flock when we actually cannot physically be with the flock.
Right. Yeah.
And so what does that look like? What does that look like for our Jewish siblings? What does that look like for our Muslim siblings? What does that look like for our Sikh siblings, our Hindu siblings? And then, even within like the variety of Christian traditions that we have. And seeing some of the posts like earlier on of like people who were like, well, we're still going to gather. And then all of a sudden you could see like the group of like, this is not Christian. This is not in the interest of life abundant, which is what many of our faith traditions tell us that we are about.
Yeah.
Jennifer.
And one thing I noticed was I had asked questions in there about, okay, how are you making these decisions? How do you decide when you can gather and when you cannot? And a lot of them were saying, well, our bishop has said this, or our governor has said this. And I was like, well, my governor, and I have no bishop, and the governor has not been very specific. And even in Georgia, the governor recommended, I don't think he mandated, but recommended that churches not meet. And I thought, well, that's helpful because then at least you have something to go off of. So that's definitely been a challenge, not having a clear sense of direction, and then feeling like the aspect in which it's kind of a political game, that it feels, like saying, well, the governor can't touch the Fourth Amendment. Well, I just want the governor to keep us safe, Right. And I understand where they're coming from. But like a couple of weeks ago, the CDC made a recommendation, and the next day the president made a different recommendation. And so it was just confusing, well, what are we doing? What are we supposed to do?
And I think like within the higher judicatory bodies of religious institutions, like we are turning to them to be like, yo, what's up?
Right. Give us some guidance.
Right. But it's also the realization of like, this is also new territory for them as well. And so within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, there were some bishops who were quicker to respond than others. And so there were some bishops who were saying, we recommend that you do this, 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 and this. And then there were other bishops who were kind of like in a holding pattern of like, well, we're just going to wait. And so that's where it kind of really got to be a sticky wicket, because I actually serve on like our geographic area. So we have a synod council, a geographic area council, and I serve on it. And getting phone calls from pastors who are like, what are you doing? And it's like, well, technically I don't serve an ELCA church right now. So I am under the guise of whatever the AME Zion church is going to be doing. But as a member of your synod council, like I can accompany you through this, and I can't tell you what to do, but I can make recommendations. And if you need to blame somebody, blame me.
Yeah.
Because I think like that's the other thing, that every action or inaction has consequences. And I think this is really, it's cause and effect, right? Like if we do something, like there's a cause and then there's an effect. And if the effect is a negative effect, it's like, well, who do we blame? Like, who do we turn to? Or like, who do we look for to an authority? And I think like right now, it's like, if something goes wrong, like who can people answer to that's not me?
Jennifer, talk a little bit about, from your perspective, Tahina's talking about kind of the bishop structure and kind of that council and larger structure. In the Baptist world, especially CBF world, CBF is more of just a guidance, really, and a resource. And fill us in on how you look to CBF for guidance or questions and answers, and maybe even sometimes just tell me what to do type of thing.
Right. Yeah. I would say, CBF primarily is a source of support. And so CBF, and that's pretty much what Jay Kiwi has communicated, is we'll support you, whatever you need, and has been very supportive on this and other things. But and I've often communicated to my church about, how CBF works. Well, CBF wants to support us to do what we sense our church is being called to do. And so in this case, it has been helpful because it's a resource to know what other churches are doing, and kind of a hub of connection for other churches that are similar to ours and similar location, because it does vary a lot by geography in terms of because I realize that too with the Facebook group is, well, some of these churches are in New York. And so, it is a different response. And so, being able to connect with local churches too. But I would say primarily from CBF, for us, it's been about support, about, encouragement and knowing other people are out there, and then the resources and those kinds of things.
So I actually have a question for both you, Bobby, and Jennifer. So within CBF, has there been collaboration between your congregations in this time?
There has some. So to be honest, I haven't participated in a lot of it, but I know there has been a couple of Zoom gatherings of clergy talking about specifically Easter service planning. And then I think there was one before that about general responses. My challenge is I have 2 young kids at home. And so I'm trying to balance that with keeping.
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of resources or Zoom meetings and that kind of stuff that I just haven't had time to do. And so there is some of that collaboration, but I have not used a lot.
Well, and also like thinking about the Zoom meetings, like Jennifer, for you as a faith leader, like what has communication been like in these days? Like, has it just, are you Zoomed out?
Well, I would be if I were doing, I mean, honestly, there's a lot that I haven't done. But we've done that some for church stuff, but I've kind of had to limit it to, how much time I have, which isn't a lot. But yes, there is that Zoom fatigue of, okay.
So let me ask you this, how in a small church, and you call yourself a small to medium church in Pendleton, how do you still keep connected to your congregation in this time? How do you deal with that challenge?
Continually offering worship services, even if it's just a video and it's not as interactive, but offering that because one thing I realized early on is if we don't do that, then they're going to watch church on TV and they may not be getting church on TV that matches our church's values and our church's interpretation. And so really, and just the connection of our people and our traditions and connecting with our church. And so offering worship consistently. And then we've, like I mentioned, trying to encourage deacons to call people. And then I've tried to call people too. And also sometimes the deacons have contacted me and said, hey, you might want to call this person because this is going on. And so, which of course we do that all the time, but now it's even more important, especially since I can't go visit anybody. So just the phone calls is really big, especially because we do have some that don't use internet. They don't use, so they don't have access to that. I did use a conference call service where I can call in and record a worship message. And so I have done that the last couple of weeks. I call in and record my sermon, and then they can call in and enter a code and listen to it. And so it's a way for people who don't use the internet to be connected and to hear the worship service that way.
One thing we talked about with Jeremy Serrano from California this past week, his video is up on our conversation on the digital church if you want to watch it. But we talked about this idea of digital stewardship. Mm-hmm. And he dropped that term on me and it blew my brain to pieces. It really kind of got my brain thinking. We talk about churches being collaborative, and he basically shared a situation where he was like, look, I am not trying to get everybody to watch my service that I'm trying to shepherd. I'm sending people to other services. I'm sending people to other resources as long as they're getting connected. And you drop that in the Bible Belt amongst a bunch of Baptists, and they're like, won't you go check out that service and we're going to provide this? That's just like, that's hard to think about. So in the terms of digital stewardship, how would you interpret that as a way to digitally serve across the denominations, across the street, across platforms? I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Well, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're kind of thinking about, but one thing it makes me think about is the way in which we have people who have moved away from this area, who are not able to be here regularly, and so this is a way they can still participate in worship. And perhaps even more significantly, I know of at least one homebound member who has not been to worship in years and really, really misses it. And now she's more connected than she has been because she can watch it at home with her husband. Usually her husband leaves her for a while and goes to church, and now they can watch it at home together. And so I've realized that for some people, they're more connected now than they were a month ago because of these resources. Or something else that made me think of, and now I've lost it.
Well, that's good. That's a good question to spin off of. When Boulevard started our live streaming a year and a half ago, it was kind of came out of the Mission Council, and their goal was to reach the homebound because we realized there were so many people that just couldn't make it. And so we started it up with mainly just an engagement tool. And before you knew it, it kind of grew and grew and grew as the opportunities grew. And we got a new pastor who's a lot younger, who was willing to push the boundaries a little bit more than Johnny was, who was just trying to retire. God bless his soul. I love him. And, but with that, there's now a conversation of, in the life of the church now, in this digital world, are we trying to engage our flock? Or are we trying to be digital evangelists?
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is a really tough conversation. It's, and I wouldn't say tough, it's more of a challenge. How do we discern between the two? And I throw that out to both of y'all. I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Well, and one thing I realized that first week that we did the live stream is I knew that morning that somebody had gone to the hospital. And normally I would have mentioned that, but I didn't mention it because it was on Facebook and I wasn't going to put that on Facebook. And so I realized, you know, there's a privacy issue too, things that I would say in a room to a congregation, and I know who's here, I'm not going to say on public internet or on something that's recorded. And so that distinction too, realizing, you know, sometimes you need to say something and you need to know only these people are going to hear it. It's not going to be this public internet wide conversation. But yeah, I don't know. That is an important distinction, I think. And, but then there's also a sense of, I guess the way I've approached it is I'm offering it as connecting with my flock, but then there may be an opportunity for people to tune in who aren't necessarily part of our flock too. But that, I would say right now, that's not really my goal, that my goal is to connect with my flock.
Tahina, what do you think?
I think the answer to that question is yes. Well, I think it depends on audience, and I think it depends on context.
Yeah.
Because I think that the Western world has given us many either or dichotomies. Like, we must be about reaching our flock, or we must be about evangelism. And I think that it can be both. I think it depends on who the audience is, who's viewing the worship service. But I also think, like, it's also like, and I hate, like, and it feels weird to use the words audience, because it's like, you know, studying professional communication, like knowing who you're communicating to. And I don't want to set worship up like a theater experience, because to me, worship is like how you offer your praise to God. It's not just, you know, it's not just a show. And so it's kind of weird in this digital world, in this digital space, of like, not just creating content for the sake of creating content, particularly when it comes to worship, but like in what we are doing, like how is that offering our thanks and praise to God? And so thinking about where I serve, that I think our digital worship, particularly our worship, is, I think it serves for both. That we have members of our church who have moved away, like Stanford. You know, it's really hard to live in Palo Alto. It's really hard to afford to live here. And a lot of times with university communities, they're so transient, because people are there to get degrees, and then they get their jobs, and their jobs are normally elsewhere. So they've been very connected to the church community, and they don't physically reside here anymore. So they've been connecting through that, but also realizing, like, people who are sheltering in place and are not familiar with like the technological know-how of like what their current congregation is doing. So thinking about like my spouse's mother, who lives in Evans, Georgia, in a retirement community. She is not 100% sure about how things are working digitally at her church. She's grateful that her pastors were calling to check in on her, but she is actually attending church at University AME Zion in Palo Alto Sunday mornings right now. But part of that is because she knows that her child is behind the scenes working the cameras and the sound. And part of that is that she knows that I'm one of the ministers in the community. So she has that connection. And so I think like it's also within the spirit of invitation, of of saying, come and see. But we're asking people to come and see in a new and different way. That yes, it is feeding our flock, and yes, it is also making that invitation at the same time to people who are seeking a flock.
I was talking to a couple recently who I'm doing premarital counseling with them, and they live in St. Louis. And we've talked a few times about looking for a church, and they've said, oh, it's just hard to find the time. And they're going back to his hometown to check on his mom. And when I talked to them recently, we said, well, one advantage right now is you can see all the churches online. So you can see more than one in a week, and you don't have to get there. That kind of gives you a taste of it. So in some ways it's an advantage if you are looking for a church, which, is not entirely genuine, but it is, you do get a sense of what worship service is like, at least a little bit.
One of the things that I've been talking with our church, I have to be careful because I'm just the chair of the communications committee. I'm not the pastor, so I only make recommendations, but but as a communicator, huh? What's that?
Bishops.
I know. But as a communicator, as a person that does this professionally, using content, I kind of have a different perspective. And one of the things I've really slowly tried to say, look, we're taking a service that we've been doing, and now we're going to make it digital. So we're going to fit that service into a digital whole, right? We're just going to keep on doing it, and let's just make it like it was still going as the best we can. Is this the opportunity to rethink worship? Does it have to be an opening with a hymn, with this, with that? Can we offer worship in a different way in this digital age that is more purposeful? Or do we still cater to the audiences that expect Sunday worship? And I think that's a multi-layered conversation from a cultural standpoint inside the church. But my thought is, I wonder on the flip side of this, when we get through this time period, what will our church look like? Will it be different? Will we be doing different things? Will we use digital differently as an extension of worship, or still the same thing as a part of worship? What are your reactions there, Jennifer? What are your thoughts, especially given the fact of your smaller congregation?
Yeah, I think that it will be a challenge when we transition back to in-person worship, because I do think there will be a desire to keep some of those things going. And the way we're doing it now, we'd have to shift it again because we're recording worship on Thursdays. And so if we go back to Sunday worship, then we'd have to figure out a way to offer that. But I feel like we need to do that, because otherwise we would be saying to people who are homebound or for whatever reason can't come that, okay, well, we offered this for you when the rest of us couldn't come, but now that we can come, then we're not offering this anymore. And so I feel like it's important, especially for those of us who weren't doing digital until now, to realize, okay, this is something that really we should be doing and need to figure out a way to continue. But it will change. One thing that's been a challenge for me is our office manager who's doing the camera keeps telling me, just look at the camera, just look at the camera. That's where your audience is. And I'm standing in the sanctuary feeling like I should be looking around the room. That's what I always do. And we've done a children's time too. And so the first week we did that, it was really hard because the children sit on the floor and I kept wanting to look down to where they were supposed to be. So it was very strange to look up the whole time. So just little things like that, figuring out, well, is our priority making a good digital product, or is our priority making a meaningful worship service? And then who are we making a meaningful worship service for? The people who are present in person or the people who are watching? And it's just a lot of questions and a lot of options.
But I also think that this is going to change church in such a way that we've never seen before. And if we're going to look at the Bible as a book of economics, of oikonomia, that realistically, and this is a hard truth, a lot of congregations are not going to financially survive this. And so this may be the one way that they can connect with their communities right now, because when shelter in place, lockdown orders are lifted, it's not going to be like an instantaneous thing, because I think part of this is also is this a dormant virus? Will it just sleep in the summer and come back in the fall? And so we don't know what that will look like yet. And so it's the realization of I think this is also, we're going to experience death and resurrection in ways that we've never anticipated. I think like physical, like with this virus, because it's unknown and it's, you know, it's, we can't see it. But I also think like what institutions of faith will look like and what they will be doing. I think for me, as long as worship reflects the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that's ultimately what matters. Like, I think like the style can change, like, you know, modulars, like the Ordo, that I think just as long as it reflects the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is what matters. But the realization that like some congregations may not get to meet in physical community after this.
I'm in the midst of, actually, if you could hear my other computer screaming right now, it's trying to spit out some video content. I'm working on a project for Thriving Rural Churches in North Carolina at the United Methodist Church. And the project is about telling stories of pastors who are in dual appointments and why the church is so important, why the Duke Endowment should still invest in the rural church of North Carolina. And so I'm in the midst of this, and I've been thinking about it. Two of the pastors that I profiled, they have dual appointments. And so they preach at 9 o'clock in the morning, they drive up the road 30 minutes, they preach again at 11, you know, and I ask them about physical buildings, and I ask them about the rural church. And one of the things that really has struck me is that I wonder if these churches are going to merge through this digital time, where both congregations are still going to have buildings, but they're going to be used for different functions, but they're going to meet digitally at the same time. And so I really think it's going to be interesting to see across the denominations what happens. And even from the difference between Boulevard and Pendleton, you know, different sizes, different commitments, different communities, same style of preaching and commitment to message, but it's going to be, it might be two different ways of approaching things. And so, Jennifer, when you look ahead, what do you see in the next couple of years for you? And I know that's a hard question to ask, especially on camera, but I mean.
And I will say too, if I had looked ahead 3 months ago, I never would have seen this. I never thought this was where we were going to be. So it's almost like, you know, it makes me think, oh, I know. I never looked ahead again.
March or something else, weren't they?
Right. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's just so hard to know. You know, I mean, it could be that, you know, when we are able to meet in person again, that there's great enthusiasm about that, and that people come back with increased enthusiasm. I think there may be people who had fallen out of the habit of worship, that now that it's no longer an option, they can't come to church, might realize they miss it and might be more committed to coming afterwards once the option was taken away. And also people who've been able to reconnect with the church, you know, without as much effort, being able to just watch it on the video, not having to get ready and come to church and do all those things, realize, oh, this is a good service. This is a meaningful connection. I want to come and be a part of this. So that's my hope. I've also thought there may be people who always thought church was an integral part of their life, and then realized not being able to go every week wasn't as big of a deal as they thought. Hopefully that won't be the case. And of course, it's also the case that you can't go anywhere else either. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's really hard to look ahead, but I think I have to be hopeful and have to think, you know, if that once we are able to meet in person again, that there will be the desire to do so. And I think an increased desire. I think that the not being able to do it for a time will make it even more meaningful when we are able to. But of course, recognizing, like you said, that it may not be. I think there's a part of, even though I know this is not the case, there's a part of me that's still thinking, well, we'll just get back to normal. We'll just get back to what we used to do. But recognizing, you know, there is the possibility that it's going to happen again, you know, that we'll be able to come back, or that even when we do come back, it will be with great caution, that there will be directives to people who are higher risk. You really don't need to come. And so it may be that when we first start back, it's a very small group, because those at higher risk really are encouraged not to. So just recognizing that, I think I'm still working on fully accepting that it's not going to be just back to normal.
Last question for both of you, and I will be respectful to your times and pull this together, but what gives you hope? What gives you hope?
I would say seeing how much people in the community and in the church have reached out, have been proactive in saying, well, who in our community needs help right now, and what can we do? Or, are there needs that we can help meet? Seeing, restaurants offer free meals to kids out of school, and just seeing so many of those things coming up, that when we're in this time of great need and great seemingly disconnection, that effort to make connections. So that gives me hope. People finding ways. I always encourage our church to think about not just ourselves, but I think that's core to the message of Christ, is thinking about other people. And so in this situation, it's not just about what do I need, what do we need, but it's about what do other people need, and who out there might need help that we can offer. And so seeing people do that and put that in practice gives me great hope that, okay, maybe we do get this Jesus message after all. Maybe we are living this right.
Well, and I think that social distancing is a misnomer. I think like we really need to talk more about like what it is to physically distance ourselves, because I think checking in on parishioners, checking in on fellow pastors, checking in on friends and family, seeing people, even though we can't physically be present for one another, that like we can still hold space for one another in this peculiar time. And there are aspects of the world of the church where like, yeah, I have been disheartened, but there are other aspects of the church where like I am seeing the church truly be the church. And it doesn't take that physical building to be the church. It takes the hands and the feet of the body of Christ to be the church. Mm-hmm. Because I think like if we remember that like, the Greek word ekklesia is the called out ones. It's not the physical building. It's the actual people.
Well, it is a pleasure to be with both of y'all. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining Tahina and I. We love chatting with people. We've got more people coming up that we're going to be chatting with. And if I would love to be able to get more CBF pastors in here. So if you can think of someone that you think would be beneficial for us to chat with, we'd love to learn from them. We're getting Tahina's church and all her network are sharing these conversations. Our friends at CBF are sharing these conversations. So I think it would be good if you know of anybody that has something to share, please let us know, because we're trying to share these anecdotes for all to consume. So
yeah, because I think like we're also in a time where we're learning a lot from one another. That the realization of like, oh, okay, so like you've done this before, so here's recommendations of like how we can help one another out in the midst of all of this. Yeah. And also realizing like we are not alone in this.